All right. So yeah, again, my name is Andrew. We're going to talk a little bit about how Red Hat does open source with respect to one repository named Foreman Ansible modules. This repository is not that big, but we do have kind of a success story with it. And I was able to get in the project early on as it was being created from scratch. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Foreman Ansible modules is, because it's kind of confusing. You don't have to read this really. It's just kind of showing you what Ansible looks like. It's just a YAML format. This is, we're looking at like somebody using the Git module to ensure that a certain repository is cloned to a certain directory. I'm being careful about the way I'm talking about it, because the way that Ansible works is it's declarative. So you say this should be like this, and you leave it up to Ansible to decide what to do to make it to that state. So obviously, normal programming languages like Python, which is what these Ansible modules are written in, they're imperative, meaning that you say like do this thing, do that thing, and then be done. You know, whatever. So anyway, the Ansible modules kind of look like this. They just have, it's just a Python script where you use this Ansible module class, and it takes in some JSON input. It does something with it, and then it outputs some JSON result. So the top one, actually using Ansible is going to be used by anybody that can use YAML. So, you know, YAML is meant to be easy to parse. So this is sysadmins, obviously developers as well. Quality engineers, consultants, what have you. You could teach anybody to do this. Whereas Python, you know, you probably have to be a developer or somebody who knows Python. But on top of that, you need domain-specific knowledge. In this case, if you were writing the Git Ansible module, you would probably need to know something about the Git Python module in order to implement some of these things. So if you want to clone a repository, there's some way to do that with Python. Okay, and then Foreman is, you can just think of it as a Rails API. There's another part called Kitello that's a Rails engine that plugs into Foreman. And there are other plugins, but these are the main two pieces that make up the Rails API. I'm not going to get into what it does, but it's in the same vein of configuration management. So anyway, the Rails API is pretty typical, pretty standard. It's accessed over HTTP. So one way, obviously, is the web UI, just like a normal Rails app. And then we also have a command line interface that is also over HTTP. So this is the way that sysadmins would script things, you know, schedule events to happen or whatnot. They would use the CLI. So this repository is just an attempt to add a third way using Ansible. And again, it's also HTTP. So it's essentially, you can think of it as Python requests. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, maybe I should not stand in front. I have taken a few commits. I looked through the commit history of this repository. You don't really need to read the commits on the left, but these are just some hand-picked commits things that we did to make it more friendly to external collaborators. So the first thing, and this is in chronological order, so the top is the very first things that we did in the repository and then going down. So the first thing is adding Travis, fixing PEP 8, automatic linting and tests. Linting is really important here. I don't know how much to stress this. Like, it's maybe one of the very first things that you should be doing in your repository. Whatever language it is, there's probably a linting tool or several. This keeps you from having, you know, pull requests submitted to your project and you say, I don't like your style. Like, I want tabs instead of spaces. I want whatever. It doesn't matter. This is something that a robot can do. So let it do that. Let it tell the person. It kind of you know, decreases any kind of social bad feelings about that. It's also kind of a hard thing to justify. It's just like, this is what we want. Obviously, we want to be consistent, but this is what we want in this repository. Tests are mentioned there. You know, we talk about tests in a whole talk, but I'm sure you guys know a lot about testing. But like starting it from the beginning or committing to putting tests in, if it's like a really early project, this is really useful, of course, because you know, you don't want new contributors that don't know much about your repository to contribute something and end up breaking some existing functionality, or additionally, you want to be like submitting tests with your own code if you're internal to the project. So this shows collaborators what you expect from them, showing them by example. So the next thing here, and these are kind of less important, I think, like automatic linting has got to be one of the top things. But anyway, so the license is really important. It doesn't matter what license you choose, that's your decision. But there are lots of companies that will not use any software that doesn't have a license. Because if they use it, and then the license is added later that says, you know, nobody can use this that has the name Red Hat. Like, you could put anything in the license, it doesn't matter. So you don't want to get in that pickle and then have to, you know, take the code out of your system, it costs money. The next thing is adding debugging instructions to the README. This seems a little weird, but have your README, you know, most READMEs are for users. So GitHub kind of suggests that you make a README on a new repository in the first place. But this specifically is for developers. You've got to put stuff in there that like either a collaboration.md or put it right in your README. But it's got to have, you know, instructions for how to do things with your project. So if you want them to run your tests before they hit your CI, you put it in the README. If it's not there, they're not going to do it. So it's pretty important. For this project, debugging Ansible modules is a little tricky. So obviously we had to do it. But even if you think that you know your audience is going to know how to use PDB or Pry or whatever, because it's just like a Python library, it's a bet you're making. You know, somebody might be discouraged and not contribute. So the next thing is a sane default configuration. This is, again, a very typical thing you get out of the box with some of the frameworks like Rails or Django. You get example configurations where you just copy it over. In this case, it's actually an Ansible configuration that tells Ansible like where the modules are and where the module utility folder is. So you just want it to be as easy as possible when somebody clones your repository, installs the dependencies, and they're up and running. So configuration of a system that you're not familiar with is pretty, you know, it's a lot to ask of new users. So the next thing is demonstration playbooks. In this case, a playbook is a collection of invocations of Ansible modules. So you say like, make sure this repository is cloned to this directory and make sure this other repository is cloned to this other directory, you know, generate a certificate, that kind of thing. So actually like showing people how to use these Ansible modules in playbook form, which is what we would expect our users to, you know, how we would expect them to use Ansible modules. You know, people love examples over documentation any day. If you write a big long documentation and you have 2 examples, they're going to look at the examples first. Guaranteed. So this is very important. And in this case, we also used it for smoke testing because it's just kind of for each module in the repository, it's just like you know, using it kind of the happy path through that module. So kind of has 2 purposes for us there. The next 3 are also important. Contributor information. If you have a company that wants to contact you to use your repository, you know, you have to have some official means of contact. If somebody is like vetting your project for enterprise use, for instance, which is, you know, what oftentimes happens at Red Hat, you know, all of our software is kind of enterprise focused. People are going to reach out over email or whatever other official way that you have listed there in the repository. So, you know, you want that there. Don't be squeamish about putting your email address out there. Next is, you know, new projects. They change a lot, and make sure that the documentation stays up to date. This can be really hard to keep on top of, but it's also something that, again, you can lose users without even knowing that you had them because they'll get stuck on this step. They'll see something wrong with the documentation. It's not working how it should work, and they'll quit. You'll never know that they were going to contribute. So that's really sad if that happens. And it's honestly a pretty easy thing. Like, there's small changes. You just got to keep on top of it. And then finally, transparent affiliations. I work for Red Hat. Most of the time I spent working on this repository was for Red Hat, not on my personal time. So my affiliation here is with Red Hat. There's another company that worked on this project from Germany, and their affiliation is in that repository as well. If you see a company, if you're looking at a repository that you want to contribute to, and you see a company listed there that you're not so sure about, like maybe you don't like Uber, maybe you don't want to, like, you know, be affiliated with that. Maybe you do. Maybe you really think Uber does a great job at open source software. And when you see Uber, that builds trust and makes you want to use the repository and contribute to it. So these affiliations, whatever your company brand or namesake is, it's good to put it out there that you're working for that company. So then, sorry that was a little long, but now we're talking a little bit more about how to build trust. So this is building trust to your community, like the people outside of your company that you want to collaborate with. You want to make sure that they trust you, and you also need to build trust of them. So first of all, and I can't even believe that I put it on the slide, but you got to be friendly to people on GitHub. Like, don't be Linus Torvalds or whoever your favorite example of bad, mean people on GitHub. Sometimes people submit something that you might think it's not useful. They might just need a little bit of a help in the right direction, and they might become your #1 contributor. You have no idea. So I don't know. This is something I shouldn't have to say, but you got to be friendly when you're trying to build a community. The second thing is you're going to set rules for your community. You've got to follow them yourself, because this is how you build trust with your community. If you're merging things without CI passing, without linting passing, not adding tests, and you're knacking pull requests from external contributors that have those same flaws, that's not going to build trust. People think that oh, Red Hat owns this repository, they're steering it in wherever direction they want. It's not good. So follow your own rules that you set for your contributor. Try to be on an equal level with them, and they'll see you as an equal. The next thing here is encouraging community reviews. I think if the repository is public on GitHub, you can review. Anybody can review. Now, what I mean by this is actually take the reviews from the community seriously. Allow people to review, and you could set whatever policies you want on the repository. So we have some repositories where you need 2 reviews. One of them has to be from a maintainer on the project. That's fine. But allow the community to do reviews, because it puts them in a different position, starting to become a maintainer of the project. It gets them more invested, and it also lets them steer the direction of the project, which, don't be scared of that. You want to openly collaborate here. You don't want to drive the ship as the company. And then finally, if you do have people that are reviewing and contributing and being great, and you're not paying them, just to remind you, you're not paying them, and they're doing all this work for you, let them have access. Give them maintainer status. Let them merge pull requests. Let them do releases. This happens all the time in Red Hat. And that's one of the reasons I really love to work for Red Hat, because we have a lot of good examples of this type of behavior. Obviously, Kubernetes is a huge collaboration. That's kind of like the nirvana of all these companies and individuals coming together to create things. People have access in a way that you can't steer certain parts of Kubernetes, because it's owned by too many parties, which is kind of good. You can discuss the merits of decisions and actually move forward with logic, not just because your company wants something. So don't be scared of that. And then finally, lead by example. I think that this kind of goes back to following your own contributor rules. So I have 2 examples here. You can't see them. It's kind of small. But the first one is somebody requesting changes on a pull request. And their comment there is a couple of minor comments, thanks to the author, and then thumbs up. That's great. You're requesting changes, you're being positive. That's what you want. The second picture is 0 of 2 checks passed on a merged pull request. Yeah, somebody just merged something because they had access and without any checks. So this could be you didn't get a review, you didn't get CI to pass, whatever it is. So don't be that person. All right. Next is building an ecosystem of use. This is just an example. You don't really have to read this, but I actually made this repository for my own personal use, and it happened to use Foreman Ansible modules. And I actually demoed it on a Foreman community demo. So Foreman is it has its own community separate from Foreman Ansible modules. And so I was able to kind of broadcast, here is an example of somebody using this Foreman Ansible modules thing that you should consider using too. Here's how easy it is. Let me show you. Again, it's just an example. People love to see other people using the software. It makes them think, that's not that hard. I could do that too. So yeah, take this and use it how you like. That was kind of the message there. And then finally, I just wanted to comment briefly on kind of how Red Hat makes money doing this, and also how it benefits the open source communities. We make a distinction at Red Hat between projects and products. So if you think about Red Hat Enterprise Linux, that's a product. Fedora would be the project. Obviously, projects are free to use. They're open source. You get self-support or IRC or something like that, mailing list. The release cycle is short, so you might get some buggy code, but the next release is on the horizon. And obviously, the documentation is community-driven, so it's a wiki or something like that. Products are basically the opposite of that. Obviously, they cost money through a subscription, and they're also vetted for enterprise use. So a certain version of a project will be chosen, and that will be that version of the next version of the product. Now, this is important because when the vetting process happens, you're taking some project version and you're putting a lot more effort into that one version. That effort has to go back into the project. So if you find vulnerabilities, this is like a Red Hat core philosophy of engineering. You have to put it back into the open source community, because if you don't, then later on, three releases later in that project, that vulnerability might still be there. So it's good for everybody to contribute, these issues found in the product version back to the projects. And then lastly, support is obviously provided by Red Hat. You're paying for it, and there are longer release cycles, so it's much more stable. And the documentation is provided by salaried Red Hat people, technical writers. So yeah, this is kind of, in a nutshell, how we do open source projects at Red Hat, and kind of a deep dive into Foreman Ansible modules. So thanks for listening.